Monsieur le ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République du Zimbabwe et président du Conseil exécutif, Simbarache Mbembenkwi, Madame la présidente de la Commission de l'Union africaine, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, ma sœur, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Monsieur le vice-président de la Commission de l'Union africaine, Mesdames et Messieurs les commissaires de l'Union africaine, Mesdames et Messieurs les dirigeants des institutions africaines, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je suis heureux de me joindre une nouvelle fois à vous en ce moment crucial. Pendant un temps, notre enthousiasme face aux bons résultats économiques du continent a eu un effet contagieux à l'origine d'une certaine paresse chez nombre d'entre nous. C'était comme si la voie vers un nouveau statut du continent était toute tracée, même si nous étions quand même tous occupés par l'adoption de nombreux cadres et stratégies centrés sur la nécessité d'une réelle transformation structurelle. Malheureusement, il est temps de revenir à la réalité. La résurgence de conflits associés à la chute de la demande et des cours des produits de base, dont le pétrole, la forte volatilité des devises, la hausse des taux d'intérêt et l'essoufflement des locomotives économiques clés, ainsi que le retour dévastateur du phénomène détesté d'El Niño, dominent une fois de plus le discours sur l'Afrique. Tâchons de mettre les choses au point. Les paramètres fondamentaux de nos perspectives économiques sont bien là et n'ont pas changé. Nous continuons d'enregistrer les taux les plus élevés de croissance dans un contexte de récession mondiale. Nos réserves internationales ont certes connu une baisse, mais cela doit être mis en regard d'autres éléments. Les niveaux de dette sont toujours bas à l'échelle internationale, les déficits publics restent sous contrôle et les investissements en provenance de plusieurs sources, certes pas de toutes, augmentent régulièrement. Des sommets tenus récemment avec l'Inde et la Chine, nos deux équivalents démographiques, ont apporté la preuve de la confiance dans notre avenir. La majorité des projets d'infrastructure n'a pas été touchée, qu'il s'agisse du nouveau canal de Suez, du plus gros barrage du monde en Éthiopie, du plus beau barrage en Afrique en Éthiopie, ou de fermes solaires d'envergure mondiale dans 3 pays. En ce qui concerne l'économie, les nouvelles sont en réalité meilleures que celles que le plus grand nombre pourrait espérer. Où sont alors ces facteurs clés qui ont fait retomber le discours dominant, encore une fois, vers le passé? Il s'agit clairement d'une combinaison de 2 facteurs. La perception d'une certaine fragilité et l'absence d'une transformation structurelle plus poussée, entendue comme la nécessité de parvenir à la fois à une productivité agricole supérieure, l'ajout de valeur aux ressources naturelles, la modernisation des services en lien avec l'explosion urbaine et le boom démographique des jeunes, sous l'effet moteur d'une industrialisation vigoureuse. C'est là tout l'objet de l'agenda 2063. Je pourrais, pendant le temps qui m'est alloué, mentionner les mesures importantes nécessaires à la mise en œuvre des objectifs de développement durable nouvellement adoptés à l'échelle mondiale et des priorités africaines afférentes. Permettez-moi plutôt de saisir cette occasion pour examiner une partie du discours sur le continent qui fait moins l'objet d'analyses stratégiques par les Africains eux-mêmes, les causes des conflits. Ladies and gentlemen, between the early hours of April 11th and the late afternoon of May 14th, 1994, 50,000 Rwandese were killed with machetes by their neighbors in the Nyamata Hill. This was a very small part of what is now considered the largest genocide since World War II. A genocide that took the lives of hundreds of thousands of Rwandese. This shocking reality requires for us to understand why was this possible. One participant in the brutal killing said, "Rule number 1 was to kill. Rule number 2 didn't exist." Do we recognize on what we call terrorists, be it Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, or those who perpetrate the carnages in Central African Republic or South Sudan, a similar rule booking? Killing without remorse, doing it like a job, better than planting or surviving in the periphery, and then have a good drink and laugh at the panic provoked and media attention. How can this happen? How can this continue to happen? Ladies and gentlemen, huge differences in the distribution and exercise of political and economic power result in violent conflicts in absence or failure of a political mechanism to address inequality. Inequality between groups rather than individuals is probably the foremost cause of conflicts in Africa. It exists on 3 mutually reinforcing levels: economic, social, and political. Relatively deprived groups seek or are persuaded by their leaders to seek redress. Privileged groups may also be motivated to fight to protect privileges. Horizontal inequalities are most likely to lead to conflict where they are substantial, consistent, and increasing over time. Exclusion, the extreme manifestation of inequality, is a major factor igniting conflicts. Of particular attention is the exclusion of youth. Uneducated or unemployed youth is a common characteristic to countries experiencing conflicts. This marginalized and excluded fraction of the population has been more prominent in the conflict as combatants and least visible during peace. Very often, the richest regions in minerals, oil and gas, and which contribute most to national revenues, are the poorest in terms of social development and general well-being. The collapse of state institutions, translated by its inability and ineffectiveness to provide basic services or security, has proven to be an important trigger to conflicts. Social stability is based on a hypothetical social contract between citizens and government. People accept state authority so long as the state delivers services and provides reasonable economic conditions. With economic stagnation, decline, or worsening state services, the social contract breaks down and violence is likely to occur. The collapse of infrastructure completes the erosion of state authority. The combination of a breakdown of institutions and physical infrastructure, coupled with the use of ethnic violence, creates the conditions in which violence becomes self-sustaining. Evidence suggests a higher incidence of conflict among countries with low per capita income, life expectancy, and meager economic opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, of the 54 African states, only eight have not experienced armed or violent conflict since independence. War confers benefits on individuals as well as costs which can motivate people to fight. Young, uneducated men, in particular, may gain employment as soldiers. War also generates opportunities to loot, profiteer from shortages and from aid, trade arms, and carry out illicit production and trade in oil, drugs, diamonds, timber, and other commodities. Where alternative opportunities are few because of the low incomes and poor employment, and the possibilities of enrichment by war are considerable, the incidence and duration of wars are likely to be greater. This greed hypothesis, as it's based in rational choice economics, very often political leaders deliberately rework historical memories to engender or strengthen cultural identities in the competition for power, but more importantly for resources, and justify the recourse to violence because of economic interest. Environmental stress can be a serious catalyst for violence too, especially when people seek alternatives to desperate situations, while resource-rich give strong motivation to particular groups to gain control over such resources. This reality is maximized by illegal trade and financial transactions that are depriving the continent of over $50 to $60 billion every year. Results show that economic performance of conflict areas is, on average, 10% below that of conflict-free areas in most GDP performance categories. A study estimated a loss of $284 billion in constant 2000 rates for 23 countries involved in conflict from 1990 to 2005 in Africa. This figure represented then an average annual loss of 15% of their GDP. Regression analysis indicates a loss of about 2.2% growth in these countries due to conflict. The interrelated nature of African economics also means that the costs of war within a sub-region generally result in economic costs for neighboring countries. These include production losses through loss of opportunities deriving from illegal migration, trade losses, increased costs of security and policing, and the cost of supporting refugees. In Niger, real GDP growth reduced to 3.6% in 2013 after expanding by 11.1% the year before, 2012. In Mali, the series of events triggered by 2012 outbreak of conflict and insecurity led to falls in government resources and expenditures by at least 30%. In DRC, internal investment as a percentage of GDP dropped from 31.6% in 1997 to 17.7% in 1998, before attaining its lowest level of 2% in the year 2000. Libya oil output has shrunk to less than 400,000 barrels per day from about 1.7 million barrels per day before the outbreak of conflict. As a result, GDP contracted by an estimated 24% in 2014. The government accounts are expected to post a deficit of about 80% of GDP this last year, with the current account deficit exceeding 60% of GDP. The message is clear. African priorities either deal upfront with the causes of conflict, or everybody will pay the price for the fragility perception. It is true that countries in Europe, Asia, or the Americas were stabilized only after prolonged wars that were fomented by the same ingredients of inequality and exclusion. They evolved to create better institutions, regulated markets, stabilized security. But it is also true that when it happened to them there was no universal telephony coverage or global media 24 cycle. A continent with more conflicts and affected people than Africa right now continues to be associated with progress and change. I'm talking about Asia. If Africa wants to follow suit, there is a need for boldness, a common security framework, and squarely accept the challenges of exclusion and managing diversity. That is the only way one deals with die-hard perceptions, particularly about Africa. Rule number 1, to kill. With rule number 2, with no rule number 2, is still mobilizing far too many in the continent. We need Africa to focus on the why and not allow this pervasive virus mentality to rotten past decade and a half achievements. Ladies and gentlemen, a virus is basically a micro-infection agent that replicates only inside the living cells or other organisms. Viruses can infect all types of life forms. Even if they are not inside an infected cell or in the process of infecting a cell, viruses exist in the form of independent particles. Viruses spread in many different ways, but they do have a pattern. It is known that virus can come from far away. The good news is that viral infections in humans provoke an immune response that usually eliminates the infecting virus. Immune responses can also be produced by vaccines, which confer an artificially acquired immunity to the specific viral infection. Africa either has strong immunity to deal with these terror groups' viral effects because of the strength of its institutions, capacities, and will, or has to develop fast a vaccine that will rid us of its damage. Such a vaccine could be labeled antidote to exclusion. Thank you.